A coffin sealed, but no body within. What secret lies buried? Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Your voices make this mystery come alive. Now let's begin. On a damp Tuesday morning, the people of Flaxborough were drawn, with their usual blend of duty and curiosity, to the parish churchyard. It was not a funeral that attracted them, though funerals were invariably well-attended spectacles in the town, but rather the absence of one. A grave had been dug, the earth was piled in a careful mound beside it, damp clods speckled with daisies and the remains of last autumn's leaves. At its foot waited a coffin, polished to a respectful sheen, its brass fittings glinting as though eager for the solemn descent. The sexton, Mr. Horrobin, stood nearby with his shovel, grumbling at the chill that had crept into his boots. But there was no body. The vicar, Reverend Tibbet, was the first to remark upon this irregularity. He approached the undertaker, Mr. Catamole, with the expression of a man about to complain of a draught in the vestry. "Mr. Catamole," he said quietly, though not so quietly that Mrs. Empson the florist could not hear, "we appear to be missing something essential." Catamole, who prided himself on an air of sepulchral serenity, looked momentarily human, his lips parted, closed, then pressed together as if sealing away an awkward truth. "The fact is," he murmured, "the deceased has not arrived." This being Flaxborough, the announcement spread faster than influenza. By the time Inspector Purbright, summoned with mild reluctance, arrived at the scene, half the High Street had already formed its theories. Mrs. Hodges, the postmistress, insisted the body had been stolen. Mr. Hockaday, the landlord of the Swan, claimed it was nothing more than a bureaucratic mistake. Miss Teat, who regularly wrote to the Flaxborough Citizen criticising modern immorality, suggested it might be linked to devil worship. Purbright, polite as ever, listened with that patient half-smile which had comforted more than one anxious widow and alarmed more than one overconfident liar. He walked slowly around the coffin, hands folded behind his back, as though it were a new monument the council had erected without consulting him. "Remarkably light," he observed, when two constables shifted the box onto their shoulders for inspection. His tone, characteristically mild, carried just enough weight to make Mr. Catamole wince. The undertaker, mopping his brow, assured all present that the coffin had indeed been delivered from his premises at dawn, sealed as per custom. No one could explain how it had arrived so empty. By midday the vicar insisted the coffin be opened in the vestry, if only to dispel the more exotic rumours circulating in the churchyard. The lid was lifted cautiously under Purbright's calm gaze. Inside lay nothing but a folded sheet. Paper. The Reverend Tibbet, hands trembling, read aloud the single sentence written in an untidy scrawl. "This grave will not take what does not belong to it." For a long while after the reading of the note, no one seemed quite sure whether to treat the affair as blasphemy, farce, or some obscure administrative oversight. Flaxborough, like most towns of its size and disposition, preferred its mysteries to be safely explained by lunchtime. Unfortunately, this one had a stubborn air of resisting digestion. The Reverend Tibbet had subsided into a chair in the vestry, fanning himself with a folded order of service. "It is outrageous," he declared faintly. "Positively outrageous. What does not belong? What grave will not take? Who, precisely, imagines himself entitled to make such judgments?" He looked, rather accusingly, at the undertaker. Mr. Catamole, polishing his spectacles with funereal diligence, muttered that in 40 years of professional practice he had never known a coffin reach consecrated ground minus its principal occupant. The implication that his establishment might be in any way negligent caused his cheeks to flush a sombre mauve, Outside, word of the missing body and the strange note had already dispersed across the market square like pigeons startled from the corn exchange. The news had reached Mrs. Hodges behind the post office counter, and by the time she recounted it to the first customer of the afternoon, the tale had acquired an additional embroidery. The coffin, she said darkly, had been found containing a goat's skull. Within the hour, this had been translated by her listener into a cockerel's head, and by supper time, the story circulating along Rose Lane involved half a sheep and black candles. Inspector Purbright, whose acquaintance with village rumour was as old as his career, accepted this flurry of imagination with unhurried calm. He instructed Constable Chubb to secure the vestry, though he suspected the note had already been well enough seen to furnish gossip for a fortnight. Then he set about the quieter, more profitable business of listening. It was in the churchyard that he found the first stirrings of something useful. An elderly gravedigger named Horrobin, whose opinions were normally confined to the price of stout and the sharpness of spades, tugged discreetly at the inspector's sleeve. "Begging your pardon, sir," Horrobin whispered, "but I'd swear the box were lighter than it should have been when it come off the cart. I mentioned it to Cattermole's lad, but he told me I'd been spending too long leaning on my shovel, said oak always feels lighter once you've had your dinner." Purbright regarded him with mild interest. "And had you had your dinner, Mr. Horrobin?" "Aye," the man admitted, "but it was only a pie, not enough to turn a coffin hollow." It was not precisely evidence, but in Purbright's patient mind the detail took its place like a pebble on a steadily growing cairn. By early evening the town was thoroughly animated. The Swan's saloon bar swelled with speculation. Mr. Hockaday, pulling pints with an air of magisterial authority, pronounced the whole affair a piece of heathen mischief, though whether committed by pranksters, dissenters, or the borough council was left open to debate. At one table, 3 members of the Women's Institute expressed grave doubts about the reliability of Mr. Cattermole's apprentices. "That pale one with the fringe," said Mrs. Maltravers, sipping her port, "has shifty eyes, the sort one sees in men who keep ferrets." Another group insisted the matter had to do with insurance. "Mark my words," muttered a retired draper. "There's money in it somewhere. Corpses don't just wander off unless there's a profit to be made." Even among the respectable, the tone shifted gradually from shock to relish. Flaxborough had, after all, not enjoyed a proper scandal since the mysterious fire in the haberdasher's warehouse 3 years ago. This, if not exactly murder, was at least a rehearsal for it. Purbright himself, as was his habit, avoided both dramatics and pronouncements. He spent an hour quietly in the vestry, examining the coffin, the folded note, and the cart upon which it had been delivered. Cattermole's men were interviewed in turn. The pale apprentice with the fringe, who trembled as though expecting arrest. The stouter youth, who maintained with rehearsed certainty that he had seen the box nailed shut before leaving the undertaker's premises. Both denied knowledge of any substitution or tampering. The inspector's questions were courteous, his gaze steady, but his pencil jotted down only the smallest details: the order of loading, the time the cart had left, the precise street by which it reached the churchyard. Back at the police station, Sergeant Love recited what little background he had managed to assemble about the supposed deceased. "One Horace Dewhurst, sir," Love said, reading from his notebook. "Age 73, late of Eastgate Cottages, retired railway clerk. Died at home, so doctor," Glaston confirmed. "Body collected yesterday evening for preparation." Purbright, who was staring thoughtfully at the note now pinned inside a folder, asked mildly, "And was Mr. Dewhurst known to be a man of disputed belongings?" The sergeant blinked. "Nothing to suggest it, sir. Bit of a recluse, I gather. Lived alone since his sister passed. No close relatives. He added, after a pause, there was some talk about a niece, but I can't find her in the records yet. The inspector said nothing but tapped the folder once against the desk, as though listening to it echo. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he decided to walk back toward Eastgate. The night was damp, the lamps throwing halos upon the wet cobbles. Dewhurst's cottage stood at the end of a narrow terrace, its curtains drawn. A constable stationed there, saluted and reported no disturbances. Purbright let himself in with the authority of quiet inevitability. The cottage smelled faintly of camphor and dust. Everything appeared in its place. A neat row of railway almanacs on the mantelpiece, slippers aligned before the hearth, a small stack of envelopes addressed in a crabbed hand. But it was on the writing desk that Purbright's attention lingered. There, among the unpaid gas bills and the remnants of ink stains, lay an envelope marked in the same untidy scrawl as the note from the coffin. Inside was a single sheet. The words were few, yet curiously emphatic. "Do not bury what is not dead." Purbright folded the paper, replaced it in its envelope, and stood very still. The ordinary tick of a mantel clock filled the silence, sounding suddenly louder than it should. He replaced his hat with deliberate care. To the constable outside he said nothing, only giving the briefest of nods before walking away. By the following morning, rumour had accelerated into full gallop. The Flaxborough Citizen printed a cautiously phrased report under the headline, "Unusual Incident at Parish Graveyard." The phrase "unusual incident" was considered by most of the town to be a gross understatement. By breakfast, half the town believed Mr. Dewhurst had been spirited away alive. The other half preferred to think his remains had been seized by medical students, secret societies, or foreign agents. The vicar spent the day fending off telephone calls from parishioners demanding consecrated explanations. Mr. Cattermole drafted a strongly worded letter disclaiming all responsibility. And Mrs. Hodges naturally had taken to telling customers that she personally had seen the missing corpse strolling along the canal towpath at dusk. Purbright, meanwhile, maintained his routine. He summoned Sergeant Love and Constable Chubb for a quiet conference. His instructions were modest. Speak discreetly with neighbours of the late Mr. Dewhurst. Make note of any mention of relatives, and above all, avoid alarming the more excitable citizens. Yet even his caution could not prevent the next disturbance. For by late afternoon, Constable Chubb, returning from an interview with a milkman, brought news that added a fresh layer of unease. "Sir," he reported, visibly agitated, "they've found something at the railway station, left luggage office, a trunk with Mr. Dewhurst's name painted on the side." Purbright looked up slowly from his paperwork. "And was there," he asked softly, "a body inside this trunk?" Chubb swallowed. "Not exactly, sir. Only a suit of clothes, laid out neat as though on a man, but no man in them." The discovery of the trunk was, in Flaxborough terms, equal to the second coming, a royal visit, and a discount on margarine, all happening at once. By the time Inspector Purbright reached the railway station, the left luggage office had been fortified by the presence of 2 constables, the station master, and no fewer than 3 members of the Borough Council who had been on their way to a licensing meeting but had diverted in the interests of civic oversight. The trunk stood on the floor in the middle of the office, its brass corners tarnished and its lid thrown back like a theatre curtain. Inside, arranged with a meticulousness that suggested the undertaker's hand yet bore an oddly personal touch, were the garments of Horace Dewhurst. A black suit, freshly pressed, with shirt, tie, and socks folded neatly atop it. Beneath them, a pair of polished shoes, laces tucked inside, and on the inner lining of the trunk, the name H. Dewhurst painted in white letters. What there was not, once again, was any sign of the man himself. Purbright examined the clothes with the sort of attention he usually reserved for railway timetables and municipal reports. He reached out with one gloved finger to shift a cuff. "They have been worn," he remarked softly. "See the creasing here at the elbows, but they have been brushed clean and folded with care." The station master, a red-faced gentleman with a beard like a steel brush, was eager to supply more detail than had been asked. "Brought in yesterday afternoon, Inspector, about 4:30. Receipt signed by a porter. Description on the docket says, 'Personal effects.'" Nobody thought twice about it until young Constable Chubb mentioned your inquiries. "Who brought it in?" Purbright asked. "That's the devil of it, sir. Porter swears it was just some fellow with a hat pulled low. Couldn't describe him properly. Might have been tall, might have been medium, said he paid in cash, didn't give a name. But the trunk already had Dewhurst painted on it." One of the councillors, Councillor Prowse, cleared his throat in a manner designed to remind everyone of his authority. "This, Inspector, is plainly a case of body snatching, or worse, of conspiracy to conceal a crime. The dignity of the town demands swift exposure." Purbright inclined his head, as though acknowledging a pronouncement on the weather. He asked instead that the trunk and its contents be taken quietly to the police station for further inspection, and he thanked the station master with a courtesy that only deepened the man's sense of frustration at not having been more useful. Back at the station, the garments were laid out on a long table in the incident room. Sergeant Love stood with arms folded, frowning at the suit, as though it might, with sufficient glaring, confess its secrets. "Looks like he stripped off neat as you please, sir. Could have been lying in bed and just stepped out of them." Purbright did not reply immediately. He paced the table, hands clasped behind his back, pausing occasionally to stoop at the collar or waistband, as though a minute particle might suddenly announce its presence. Finally he said, "It would appear, Sergeant, that Mr. Dewhurst has left us 2 notes, one in his coffin, another at his home, both warning against burial. And now we have his clothes, laid out with care, but conspicuously empty. The suggestion, I fear, is either that he was not dead when thought to be, or that someone is most determined we should think so." Love muttered something about damned queer business, and for once even Constable Chubb, who usually found comfort in simple conclusions, nodded solemnly. News of the trunk, despite all efforts at discretion, spread rapidly. By evening the Swan was crowded beyond capacity. A lively trade was done in drinks for those willing to expound on the symbolic meaning of discarded clothing. Mrs. Maltravers announced it was plainly a ritual act, while Mr. Hockaday ventured that it was insurance fraud with theatrical touches. Someone else recalled a tale of a local man who had faked his death to avoid a tax bill, though upon inspection this turned out to have been a cousin of someone in Grantham. The Reverend Tibbet, who came reluctantly to the bar in search of steadying brandy, found himself besieged by questions as to whether the resurrection might be imminent. He returned home with a headache and a dim suspicion that theology was less respected in Flaxborough than gossip. Meanwhile, Purbright directed Sergeant Love to canvass Dewhurst's neighbours. The reports trickled back the next morning, none conclusive, but all oddly coloured by individual bias. One neighbour described Dewhurst as a recluse who had barely spoken to anyone since his sister's death. Another insisted he had been perfectly sociable, often seen tending his roses and chatting over the fence. A third, a spinster of precise habits, claimed he had entertained female visitors on at least 2 occasions, though when pressed, she admitted the visitors might in fact have been district nurses. There was, however, one detail that caught Purbright's quiet attention. A boy delivering newspapers recalled seeing a stranger call at Dewhurst's cottage in the week before his death. A man in a grey overcoat, carrying a small leather case, who had stayed for nearly an hour. The boy could not describe him well, save that he walked with a slight stoop and smoked incessantly. Purbright thanked the boy with unusual gravity, then returned to his office, where the second note still lay in its envelope. He read the words again, "Do not bury what is not dead." It had about it the air of warning rather than mischief. That afternoon he visited Dr. Glaston, who had certified Dewhurst's death. The doctor, a small, sharp-nosed man whose handwriting could defeat even the most determined chemist, was brisk in defending his professional judgment. "Dead as a herring," he declared. "No doubt about it. Heart gave out, quite unremarkable at his age. I've seen hundreds. Pupils fixed, pulse absent, skin cooling. Textbook. I signed the certificate myself." "And yet," Purbright said mildly, "the body is missing. The coffin empty, the clothes abandoned, and notes appear suggesting premature burial." The doctor bridled. "Inspector, I am not in the habit of burying live men. The suggestion is outrageous. If anyone has meddled with the corpse, that is another matter entirely." Purbright inclined his head, but his eyes did not leave the doctor's face. On his way back through the market square, he was intercepted by Mrs. Hodges from the post office, who clutched at his sleeve with the air of imparting confidential intelligence. "I saw him, Inspector, last night. Down by the canal. He was wearing a dark coat and hat, but I swear on my good name it was Dewhurst himself." He turned, saw me, and disappeared into the fog. Purbright received this with a courteous expression that gave away neither credence nor dismissal. He thanked her gravely and walked on. But in his notebook later, he wrote one line: "Alleged sighting, canal towpath." By evening, Sergeant Love reported another curiosity. Among Dewhurst's few papers, they had found an old insurance policy, never cashed, but still active, naming a beneficiary, Miss Clara Dewhurst, niece. The address given was in a village 20 miles away. The document was 20 years old, but it was the first concrete lead to family. As the day closed, the town buzzed with speculation, the Swan's takings soared, and the vicar prayed for the restoration of ordinary funerals. But Inspector Purbright, sitting alone in his office, regarded the two notes, the empty trunk, and the insurance paper with his usual air of patient curiosity. Somewhere within these fragments was a story less theatrical but more human than the townsfolk supposed. It was at that moment Sergeant Love entered, looking unusually pale. He held out a slip of paper. "Message just come through from the next county, sir." "About a woman fitting the name Clara Dewhurst." Purbright read it slowly. His expression did not change, but his voice was very quiet. "So she has disappeared too." The disappearance of Clara Dewhurst entered Flaxborough consciousness, not as a fact, but as a flavour. The Citizen, cautious as ever, reported only that police inquiries were being made in connection with a relative believed to reside in the county. Yet by mid-morning, the town had decided, with that unerring instinct for embroidery, that the niece had absconded with the body under cover of night, carrying it in a wheelbarrow through the fields and across the border. Mrs. Maltravers announced this with authority at the hairdresser's, citing her brother-in-law's opinion that such things were commonplace abroad. Inspector Purbright, however, preferred to deal in quieter certainties. He began the day with a visit to the station's teleprinter, where the message lay confirming Clara's absence. The landlady at her supposed address reported that Miss Dewhurst had left her room suddenly 2 days earlier, leaving rent unpaid and possessions intact. A travelling case was missing, but nothing else. She had mentioned in passing a visit to family business. Purbright folded the message carefully and slipped it into his case. He was not surprised, though the sequence pleased him with its tidy inevitability. First the absent body, then the theatrical trunk of clothes, then the vanished relative. A pattern was beginning to whisper itself, though not yet loudly enough to be named. He sent Sergeant Love to the railway station to check tickets purchased in the last week to the niece's village. Constable Chubb was dispatched to canvass the pawnshops for any articles bearing the name Dewhurst. Both returned with very little, though Chubb, apologetic, admitted he had been offered 3 separate accounts of seeing Horace Dewhurst alive, each from people whose eyesight was known to be unreliable beyond 3 yards. The inspector, meanwhile, walked to the library. Not, as Love suspected, in search of municipal by-laws to consult, but to glance over the back issues of the Citizen. There, in a file bound with worn cord, he found 2 short mentions of Horace Dewhurst over the past decade. One, attending a meeting on railway pensions, another, a letter of complaint about noise from the gasworks. Both suggested a man who valued order, regularity, and perhaps a little privacy. Leaving the library, he was intercepted by Councillor Prowse, who had acquired a proprietary heir in the affair. This business, Inspector, reflects very poorly on the borough. Coffins without bodies, relatives vanishing, it's unseemly. We must have prompt action. I urge you to consider the possibility of exhuming previous burials, lest there be a pattern. Purbright listened with untroubled patience. "You would suggest," he inquired, "a general survey of the cemetery to ensure the town's dead are where we believe them to be?" Prowse coloured slightly. "Not precisely general, of course, but one never knows what contagion of mischief may be abroad. It could affect rates." Purbright thanked him for his concern and walked on. He did not hurry, he rarely did. By evening the station had received a telegram from a small boarding house in Lincoln. A woman answering Clara's description had taken a room under the name Mrs. Green. She had left again that morning, leaving no address. The boarding house keeper remarked that she seemed anxious and had asked repeatedly about trains to London. Purbright read this information aloud to Sergeant Love. "London," he said thoughtfully. "A convenient city for losing oneself, or for arranging a transaction unnoticed." Love scowled. "If she's after the insurance money, sir, that'd be her place to try it. Big enough to hide, plenty of shady folk to help." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. He tapped the envelope containing the 2 cryptic notes. "Yet the tone of these is not mercenary. They speak of what must not be buried. I wonder if Miss Dewhurst understands them better than we." The next day brought a fresh ripple of excitement. A bargeman reported to the police that he had seen, while moored by the canal at dusk, a figure resembling Dewhurst pacing the towpath. The description matched almost exactly that given by Mrs. Hodges. The bargeman swore to it, though added that the figure had moved with surprising swiftness for an old man. Purbright filed the report, neither endorsing nor dismissing it, but he made a note to walk the towpath himself at night. That evening, with the lamps of the town dwindling behind him, he strolled along the canal bank. Mist rose from the water in wreaths, a hedgehog rustled in the grass, but no spectral pensioner emerged. Only the steady lap of water against the bank accompanied him. Returning, he passed the Swan, where laughter and speculation spilled through the door like smoke. He could hear, even without entering, that Dewhurst had become a character of myth. Some spoke of him as a ghost, others as a fugitive, some even as an avenger against the council. Purbright, pausing to listen, reflected that truth in Flaxborough was always a faint, frail thing, easily overwhelmed by invention. At the station the following morning he found that Sergeant Love had been busy. The sergeant had traced the origin of the trunk. It had apparently been purchased second-hand from a dealer in town a fortnight earlier by a woman giving the name Clara Dewhurst. This, though it seemed to tighten the circle, did not wholly satisfy Purbright. He examined the dealer's account. The woman had been described as nervous, with a soft voice and a veil. The dealer was sure of her identity, though he admitted he had not asked for proof. The inspector sat back in his chair, hands folded, eyes half closed. "If Miss Dewhurst purchased the trunk herself," he said at last, "it suggests she prepared in advance to make use of it, which in turn suggests she expected some alteration in her uncle's circumstances." Love grunted, meaning she knew he was going to die, or meant him to, Purbright added gently. The thought hung in the room like a draught. But before it could settle, Constable Chubb arrived with another interruption. He had been speaking with an elderly neighbour of Dewhurst's, a Mrs. Price, who now remembered something of potential significance. "She says, sir, that a week before he died, Mr. Dewhurst had a visitor. A young lady, smartly dressed." Mrs. Price overheard them talking through the open window. "She swears he called her Clara, and she swears he said, 'You'll get nothing from me while I draw breath.'" Purbright listened with eyes half-lidded, the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Then," he said softly, "we may at last be hearing Mr. Dewhurst's own opinion on the matter." The pieces were aligning. A quarrel, a premature death, a missing body, an empty coffin, a vanished niece, but still no corpse, no proof, and no certainty of crime. Purbright, as ever, refused to leap to conclusion. He preferred, instead, to set a question gently into the air and wait for it to fall of its own accord. That evening he walked again along Eastgate, where Dewhurst's cottage lay in orderly silence. He paused at the garden gate, noting the neatness of the roses, the faint rattle of the letterbox in the breeze. Then, quite suddenly, he turned his head. In the lamplight across the street, a figure stood watching him. For a second, only a second, it seemed to be Horace Dewhurst himself, stooped, hat pulled low, coat buttoned to the throat. Then, as Purbright stepped forward, the figure melted into the shadows and was gone. Inspector Purbright walked back from Eastgate, with his hat pulled low against the night mist, and his mind less tranquil than usual. He was not in the habit of crediting shadows with corporeal form, nor did he place great weight on glimpses half obscured by fog and lamp glow. Yet he knew that what he had seen had been more than imagination. A living man had stood across the road from Dewhurst's cottage and had withdrawn the instant he was observed. Whether it was Dewhurst himself or some imitator, the effect was the same. The mystery had taken flesh. The following morning the inspector did not mention the encounter to his subordinates. Instead, he listened with his customary patience as Sergeant Love produced the latest contributions from Flaxborough's unofficial detective bureau, the Citizenry. Mrs. Hodges, it seemed, had amended her earlier story. Now she was sure she had seen Dewhurst not by the canal, but boarding a bus to Grimsby. A charwoman swore she had glimpsed him entering the back door of the Corn Exchange, though she admitted she had mislaid her spectacles that day. Purbright made no comment, merely penciled them into his notebook under the column marked Embellishments. What concerned him more was a wire received from Lincoln. Clara Dewhurst had been sighted once again, this time in the company of an unidentified man at a tea shop. She had looked pale, even distressed, but had departed quickly before being spoken to. The man was described only as elderly, grey, stooped. Purbright read the description without raising an eyebrow, though he noticed Sergeant Love shifting uneasily in his chair. "If it's him, sir," the sergeant said gruffly, "then the doctor's made the mistake of his life. Dead men don't stroll about tea shops." "They do not," Purbright agreed mildly. "Which leaves us the alternative that Mr. Dewhurst is not as dead as believed, or that someone wishes us all to think so." Love frowned. "But the notes, sir, they sound as though he wrote them himself." "Indeed," Purbright said, glancing at the envelope on his desk, "and the handwriting is his. The question is whether the hand that wrote them is still attached to a breathing arm." Later that day, Purbright visited Dr. Glaston once again carrying with him the notes. The doctor examined them with nervous irritation. Yes, the writing is his. I've had prescriptions from him. He was always fond of ordering liniments. But I tell you, Inspector, I certified his death correctly. The heart had stopped, pupils fixed. There was no mistake. Purbright's gaze rested on the man long enough to make him colour. "And you were alone at the time of examination?" "Entirely alone. The housekeeper called me, but she left the room while I conducted the necessary checks." "Housekeeper?" "Yes, a Mrs. Penfold, old retainer. She did for the Dewhursts when the sister was alive, and after that stayed on, out of loyalty or lack of better employment. A taciturn woman." Purbright noted the name carefully. Housekeepers had a way of observing details which doctors, in their hurry, might overlook. The inspector made his way that same evening to the cottage, where Mrs. Penfold received him with suspicion softened only by his grave courtesy. She was a tall woman, lean as a rake, her hands reddened by years of scrubbing. At first she professed to know little. Mr. Dewhurst had been a quiet man, not given to conversation. She had found him collapsed in his chair and run for the doctor. But, pressed gently, she admitted there had been visitors. The niece, certainly, though she had come rarely until the last month, when her visits became more frequent. And once, a week before his death, she had seen him in heated argument with her. "She wanted money, I think," Mrs. Penfold said, eyes narrowed. "Said she had a right to it. He told her plain she'd never get a penny while he breathed." "And afterwards?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Penfold's hands tightened on her apron. "Afterwards she came again, the day he was found. Said she wished to sit with him. I let her in. I thought it no harm. When I returned half an hour later, she was gone, and he was slumped in his chair, eyes staring." Purbright inclined his head slowly. "Did you notice anything unusual in the room?" The housekeeper hesitated, then admitted. "There was a smell. Not of death. Something sharp, like medicine. But the doctor came, and I supposed it part of his work." Purbright thanked her and left her to her silence. The next morning he called on Sergeant Love. "You will obtain from Dr. Glaston the precise medicine he himself administered or prescribed for Mr. Dewhurst. If it differs in any respect from what Mrs. Penfold recalls, note it." Love grumbled but obeyed, returning later with confirmation. The doctor had prescribed only mild powders for indigestion. Nothing sharp, nothing acrid. That same day, Constable Chubb returned from inquiries at Lincoln. He had spoken with the tea-shop proprietor, who confirmed Clara had been there, with an older man. But the proprietor swore the man was not frail, merely stooped, as if by habit. He had ordered tea and seed cake in a voice quite steady. "Not a ghost's voice," the man added, with rustic certainty. So Dewhurst, if it was Dewhurst, was travelling, meeting his niece, leaving trunks of clothes and warning against burial. The town, of course, had long since leapt to the conclusion that he was alive, a conviction which thrilled the public far more than the prospect of fraud or homicide. In the Swan that evening, wagers were being laid as to where he might next appear, the railway buffet, the livestock market, or perhaps in the choir stalls on Sunday. But Purbright did not gamble. Instead, he requested quietly that Love and Chubb take turns watching Dewhurst's cottage, though without making their presence obvious. His own steps took him once more along the canal towpath, where Mrs. Hodges claimed her sighting. It was there, beneath a dripping willow, that he paused. On the damp earth were impressions, footprints recently made. One set heavier, dragging slightly, the other lighter, narrower, with the pointed heel of a woman's shoe. They led together along the bank and then disappeared where the grass grew thick. Purbright crouched, examining them with unhurried eyes. He touched the earth with his fingertips, gauging the freshness. Then he rose and looked steadily at the black water. When he returned to the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with a piece of fresh information. Clara Dewhurst, it seemed, had withdrawn money from a savings account in Lincoln, a considerable sum for a woman of modest means. The date of withdrawal was the same as the day she had last been seen with the older man. "She's paying for something, sir," Love said grimly. "Or for someone," Purbright replied. The inspector stood for a while at the window of his office, watching the mist gather over the square. Slowly he closed the file and set it aside. That night, just after midnight, Constable Chubb knocked urgently at his door. He had been on watch near Eastgate. There had been movement at the cottage, lights flickering where none should be, and the sound, faint but certain, of footsteps across the floorboards. When Purbright arrived, the house stood dark and silent once again. Yet the back door was unlocked, and in the kitchen a candle still burned, guttering low. On the table lay a slip of paper, scrawled in the same hand as before. It read, "You cannot put me under earth while I breathe the air above it." Inspector Purbright stood in the silent kitchen, the candle flame wavering as though uncertain of its right to be there. The note on the table seemed freshly laid, the ink still glistening faintly, the strokes bold and unhurried. He read the words again, "You cannot put me under earth while I breathe the air above it," and allowed himself no more than a brief tightening of the lips. He folded the slip into his pocket and motioned to Constable Chubb to keep his voice low. "Were you certain the house was empty before this light appeared?" he asked. Chubb, round-faced and earnest, nodded vigorously. "I'd been outside since 10, sir. Not a soul went in unless they used the back field. The light came sudden, about 12:15. I waited, then fetched you." Purbright glanced around the kitchen, his eyes taking in the small traces that the ordinary observer overlooked. A chair slightly out of place, crumbs scattered beside the plate, the faint smell of tobacco unfamiliar to the house. Someone had been comfortable enough to sit, eat, and leave a message. That suggested confidence, perhaps even defiance. Upstairs they found nothing disturbed save one cupboard, half open, which contained men's clothing neatly folded. One suit was missing, no sign of forced entry, no indication that the intruder had feared discovery. It was as though the house still belonged to its old master, and he had returned at his leisure. Back outside, Purbright dismissed Chubb with instructions to double the watch, but without speaking to anyone in the village. "If word spreads too soon," he remarked, "we shall have Dewhurst reported simultaneously in 4 separate counties before breakfast." By morning, however, the rumour mill needed no help. A boy delivering milk had seen the inspector and a constable prowling near the cottage and told his mother, who told the grocer, who told half the market square. By mid-afternoon it was common knowledge that Dewhurst had risen, and people began walking by the cottage in hopeful little groups, staring at the drawn curtains. Sergeant Love reported this development with disgust. "It's like waiting for the curtain to go up at the Empire, sir. They'd buy tickets if they could." "Let them," Purbright replied evenly. "The more eyes, the better, though we must not depend on them seeing what is there, only what they hope for." Love shifted, clearly troubled. "But these notes, sir, if they're written in his hand and left where he lived, Then how can we call it anything else but him?" Purbright gave him a sidelong look. "I did not say it was not him. I said we must not assume." That afternoon, Purbright arranged a discreet meeting with the bank manager who had overseen Clara Dewhurst's withdrawal. The gentleman, plump and obliging, confirmed that she had taken out the equivalent of several years' savings. She had appeared nervous, even furtive, but not altogether unwilling. He added, lowering his voice, that she had been seen entering the account in company with a man, tall, stooped, wearing a hat pulled low. Returning to the station, Purbright found a message awaiting him from Lincolnshire police. They had intercepted a cab driver who claimed to have driven an older gentleman, accompanied by a woman matching Clara's description, to a small boarding house 2 nights before. When officers visited, however, the pair had gone. The inspector sat for a long while in his office, turning the matter over. Every new detail seemed designed to confirm Dewhurst's survival, yet each was slippery, never quite solid. And through it all ran the niece, withdrawals of money, sudden journeys, meetings concealed. That evening, Purbright decided to see her directly. Clara Dewhurst received him at the lodging house where she was known to stay when in town. She greeted him with a brittle politeness, though the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed strain. "Inspector," she said, clasping her hands tightly, "you've come about my uncle." "About the many uncles that seem to be wandering the county," he replied gently. "Tell me, Miss Dewhurst, are you quite certain your uncle is dead?" Her composure faltered. I don't know. I was told he was." "Then people say they've seen him. I've heard his voice." She broke off, biting her lip. "His voice?" Purbright leaned forward. "Yes, on the telephone. A week ago, he called me. He said he was safe, but I must bring him money, otherwise he would be forced back to his grave." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Inspector, it was him. I swear it." Purbright regarded her steadily. "And you brought the money?" She looked away. "Some of it. Not all. I was afraid." The inspector did not press her further. Instead, he asked for the number from which the call had come, but she shook her head helplessly. She had answered at a public box, and the line had been dead when she tried to trace it. When Purbright left her, the evening was closing in, the lamps beginning to glow in the square. He walked slowly back to the station, his mind occupied not by Clara's words, but by her manner. Fear was there, certainly, but not the fear of a ghostly uncle. Rather the fear of being found complicit in some design she half understood, half resisted. The following day brought a small breakthrough. Sergeant Love, grumbling but diligent, had checked suppliers of ink and stationery in the area. The notepaper used in the messages was traced to a single shop in Flaxborough, whose proprietor remembered selling several packets recently to a grey gentleman, soft voice, polite. That description, inevitably, matched half the elderly men in town, but it was enough to place the origin locally. Meanwhile, Constable Chubb brought word that the cottage had been visited again in the night. This time no note was left, but in the hearth were ashes of burned paper. Purbright sifted through them himself, retrieving only a few charred fragments, a corner of envelope, the remains of a figure, perhaps a number. Someone had been destroying correspondence. That evening, as the inspector considered his next move, a telegram arrived from the coroner's clerk. It reported that the burial certificate for Mr. Dewhurst had never been filed, though Dr. Glaston had sworn it had been prepared. No body had been interred. Purbright read the message twice, then folded it carefully. If the death had not been formally recorded, then what lay in the grave, if there was a grave at all, was open to question, perhaps nothing, perhaps someone else. The inspector's next step was quiet but deliberate. He sought permission for the exhumation of Dewhurst's supposed resting place. Bureaucracy was its slow wheel, but Purbright applied his customary persistence. Meanwhile, he tightened surveillance on Clara, instructing Love to keep her comings and goings discreetly monitored. 2 nights later, a report arrived that Clara had taken a late train, carrying a valise. Purbright, apprised at once, travelled in pursuit. He found her disembarking at a small junction town, glancing about nervously. She entered a narrow street, pausing at a boarding house with drawn blinds. From a dark corner, Purbright watched her knock twice, pause, then knock once more. The door opened, and she slipped inside. Moments later, a silhouette passed briefly across the curtained window, tall, stooped, unmistakably a man's. Purbright's heart did not quicken, though his eyes sharpened. Whoever the figure was, Clara believed it to be her uncle, and whether it truly was Dewhurst, or a masquerader using his likeness, the inspector knew the time was drawing near when the truth would either stand or collapse. He remained in the shadowed street until the lights within dimmed. Then, with silent steps, he approached the house and tried the back gate. It yielded easily. Inside, a faint sound reached his ear. Low voices, one male, one female. Clara's tone urgent, pleading, the other calm, deliberate. Purbright waited, the night pressing close about him, certain that the veil was about to lift. The voices ceased suddenly. A footstep crossed the floor. The door latch rattled. Purbright drew back into darkness, his hand tightening on his stick. The door opened, and in the frame stood a man, tall, bent at the shoulders, his face hidden in shadow. He stepped into the night air as though emerging from the grave itself. The morning after his visit to Mrs. Lum's, Inspector Purbright found himself once again pacing the narrow corridor outside his office. The silence of the station was broken only by the scratch of Sergeant Love's pen in the report room. Purbright's mind, however, was far from silent. He was replaying his talk with the undertaker, the hesitant observations of Mrs. Lum, and the nervous chatter of townsfolk who were only too happy to repeat gossip, but reluctant to name its origins. He had in his mind an impression, hazy but persistent, that the Coffin incident was not the beginning of the story, but a consequence of something older and far less respectable. Sergeant Love, lumbering in with a pile of forms, interrupted his reflections. "We've traced the coffin order, sir. Paid for in cash 2 days before the funeral. Signed only as a guest. The handwriting's a shaky sort, but neat enough to show practice." Purbright looked up. "A guest?" His smile was brief and humourless. "Our anonymous benefactor shows at least a little wit." He reached for the slip of paper that Love held out and studied the careful loops and strokes. Something about the exaggerated flourish of the G bothered him. It was the sort of mannerism one adopted when wishing to appear more cultivated than one was. "And," Love continued, "the vicar's wife says that the late Miss Pallithorpe had no relatives left to speak of. A few cousins in Leeds, but they haven't been seen here in years, which makes the whole funeral something of a puzzle. Who arranged it, if not family?" "Indeed," Purbright murmured, tapping the edge of the paper against his desk. "And why should an anonymous guest take such trouble to provide for her burial, yet neglect the small matter of supplying a body?" Love frowned as though the matter were a personal insult. "Do you suppose, sir, that the whole thing was a prank?" "A prank involving a coffin, a funeral service, and the expense of a grave?" Purbright shook his head. "I think not, Love. No one goes to such effort merely for amusement. But it may be that someone wished to create the appearance of death where none occurred, or perhaps to obscure a different death altogether." That afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to the Palethorpe house itself, a drab, red-brick semi-detached, in a street where curtains twitched industriously at his approach. The front garden was rank with untrimmed hedges and a scatter of cracked ornaments, 2 chipped swans, a concrete gnome without a head. The house itself had the forlorn air of long neglect. He knocked twice before the door opened an inch. The woman who peered out was sharp-featured, middle-aged, and dressed in an apron streaked with flour. "If you're collecting, you'll get nothing here," she snapped. Purbright inclined his head politely. "Inspector Purbright, madam, may I trouble you for a moment? I understand you may have been acquainted with Miss Palethorpe." At the name, her hostility faltered. She pushed the door wider, though still holding it close to her side, as if to guard against intrusion. Ada Palethorpe? Well, I wouldn't say acquainted. She lived across the way these 20 years, but she wasn't one to pass the time of day. Purbright allowed the pause to linger before asking gently, "Did you observe any unusual visitors in recent weeks? Or any arrangements made concerning her property?" The woman sniffed. "Not that I noticed. Except, well, there was a man called more than once, tall, thin, always in dark clothes. Came in a hired car, I'd say, from the way it smelt of petrol when he pulled up. He went in evenings and left before dark, never spoke to anyone. Would you recognize him again?" "I should think so. He had a face like a crow, long nose and those little eyes that seemed to peck at you." Purbright thanked her gravely, then took his leave. As he walked back to the car, he reflected on the curious selectivity of memory. Neighbours who claimed not to know. A thing often turned out to have catalogued their subjects with the meticulousness of archivists. He jotted a few notes: tall, thin, dark clothes, hired car, crow-like face. Later, back at the station, Love was eager with a small discovery. "Sir, the handwriting on the coffin order, Mr. Pollen from the bank, thinks it resembles the hand of Councillor Gribbin. Says he writes flourished G's like that on his cheques." Purbright raised his brows. Councillor Gribbin was a stout, ruddy man known chiefly for his zealous chairmanship of the Parks Committee and his loudly proclaimed disdain for extravagance. The notion of him ordering a coffin in secret seemed absurd. Yet it was not impossible. Men were often more various in their private dealings than their public reputations suggested. That evening, Purbright accepted an invitation to supper at the vicarage, where talk over cold ham and pickles inevitably returned to the affair. Mrs. Chubb, the vicar's wife, leaned confidentially toward him and whispered, "Inspector, it was all most unsettling. The hymns were sung, the prayers read, and yet I could not help noticing that the coffin seemed curiously light. The bearers scarcely strained at all." She gave a delicate shudder. "And then, when I later heard there had been nothing within it, I could not help but wonder whether it was not some dreadful mockery of Christian burial." Purbright expressed sympathy, though his mind was already working ahead. If the coffin were light, then the bearers must have realized something was amiss, yet none had spoken. Silence of that kind was rarely without cause. The next day he summoned the 4 men who had carried the coffin. They were labourers from the council works department, rough-voiced but respectful in his presence. Yes, they admitted the coffin had felt oddly light, but they had assumed it to be a matter of frail remains, or perhaps an especially well-made casket. One of them, however, hesitated before answering. "Well, Inspector," the man said, shifting uneasily. "There was one thing. When we lifted it, I heard something inside, like a scuff or a slide, as if summat had moved. But it weren't no body, I'll swear." "What then?" "I couldn't say. Just a kind of hollow thud. And then it was gone." Purbright thanked them. his expression giving nothing away. Yet, as he returned to his office, a slow unease pressed on his thoughts. A coffin, bought by an anonymous guest, borne almost weightless to a grave, containing not a corpse, but some shifting object. The affair was beginning to resemble not a mistake, but a deliberate performance, staged for reasons still hidden. Late that night, while the town settled into its quiet routines, a groundsman at the cemetery made a discovery that would pull the matter into darker waters. Doing his final round with a lantern, he noticed that the earth above Miss Palathorpe's grave was disturbed. Not the natural settling of soil, but the fresh marks of spade and boot. Someone had been at the grave after dark, and not with reverence. When the groundsman reported it at dawn, the constable who attended took one look at the churned soil and the boot prints around it before hurrying to telephone Inspector Purbright. By the time Purbright arrived, the morning mist still clinging to the grass, it was clear enough what had happened. The coffin had been exhumed in the night, and when it was lifted from the ground, prized open before the horrified witnesses, they found it no longer empty. Inside lay a body, cold, stiff, and with a bruised line about the throat that spoke all too plainly of strangulation. It was Ada Palathorpe herself. The scene at the cemetery lingered in Inspector Purbright's mind long after the crowd of townspeople had been ushered away and the body taken into custody. The mist still clung low on the grass, mingling with the acrid smell of damp earth that the grave-diggers' spades had turned over. He could hear the low murmurs of shock ripple among the bystanders even as they dispersed, each voice already twisting the facts into a version fit for gossip. By midday, half the town would have decided that Miss Palathorpe had clawed her way into the coffin herself and been strangled by spirits for her trouble. Yet Purbright knew the truth was neither so fanciful nor so simple. The bruising on the throat was plain, ugly, and unmistakably human in its origin. Miss Palathorpe had been alive long after the coffin had been ordered and filled with nothing. Someone had strangled her, then placed her body in the coffin later, after the sham funeral had concluded. The question that knotted itself in his mind was, why the deception first, and the burial afterward? It was as though the murderer had wished her publicly entombed without a body, only to correct the absence later, as though realizing that too much attention was being drawn to her non-existence. Back at the station, the corpse was examined under the care of Dr. Hilliard, who conducted his post-mortem with an air of irritated fastidiousness, as though death were a personal inconvenience to him. He peered at the bruises, tugged gently at the dead woman's wrists, and finally announced, "Strangulation without doubt. A cord or thin rope, likely from behind. Time of death, within the last 36 hours, which means, Inspector, that she was certainly alive when her funeral was performed." Purbright, who had already suspected as much, accepted this confirmation with a grave nod. "And any sign of struggle?" "None to speak of, no defensive wounds. She was either taken entirely by surprise, or she trusted the person who killed her." This last statement caused Purbright to pause a moment longer than necessary. Trust was often a murderer's most useful weapon. He thanked Hilliard, then instructed that the body be kept under guard until arrangements could be made for a proper inquest. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love had been busy tracing hired cars in the district, hoping to match the neighbor's description of the crow-faced visitor. He arrived in Purbright's office with his usual half-triumphant, half-baffled expression. "We've narrowed it, sir. Only 3 cars hired locally in the past month, all by men coming from outside the town. One was a salesman staying at the Crown Hotel, one a fellow who claimed he was visiting family in Thorpe End, and the last, a gentleman who gave no proper address, signed himself as Mr. Ainsley. paid cash. The garage proprietor described him as, Love consulted his notebook, thin, black-suited, with a face like a bird that's missed its dinner. Purbright allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction. Our crow-faced gentleman, then. And did this Mr. Ainsley return his car? No, sir. Not yet due. It was rented for a week. Should still be about unless he's scarpered with it. Purbright rose, smoothing the creases from his coat. Then, love, it would be wise for us to make discreet inquiries at every lodging-house and hotel in the district. A man of such description cannot perch unnoticed for long. The inquiry began that very afternoon. Purbright and Love walked the circuit of the smaller establishments first, where strangers drew more curiosity than comfort. At the third lodging-house, a nervous landlady admitted she had let a room to a Mr. Ainsley 3 nights earlier. Yes, tall and thin. Yes, wore black. No, he had not been home since last night. And he carried a small leather case, Inspector, she added. I thought it odd. Never opened it while I saw him, kept it close at all times, as though it had something precious inside. When Purbright asked to see the room, she produced the key with alacrity, eager to be rid of suspicion. The room was modest, iron bedstead, worn rug, cracked wash basin. But there were small details that caught Purbright's eye. On the writing table lay a scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet, bearing the faint indentation of writing pressed on from the missing page. He laid it flat and tilted it toward the window. The grooves resolved into fragments of words. Thursday. Delivery. Cemetery. Payment. Love leaned over, his voice low. Sounds like arrangements, sir? Yes, Purbright replied, sliding the fragment carefully into an envelope. But arrangements for what? And to whom were they addressed? More curious still was the faint smell in the air. Not tobacco, not cologne, but something metallic and acrid, reminding Purbright of lamp oil. He crouched to inspect the floorboards near the bed and saw where a droplet had stained the wood. Not much, but enough to suggest some small leakage from a container. The landlady, summoned once more, declared she had noticed no odd smells, though she admitted Mr. Ainsley had been the sort of guest who shut the door quickly as if afraid the air might follow him out. It was past dusk. When Purbright returned to the station, his thoughts pressing harder with every step. Miss Pallithorpe's death, the false funeral, the reburial, the stranger with the crow-like face. It was no longer a simple puzzle of eccentric behaviour. It had the markings of design, though its purpose remained stubbornly hidden. That night, as the lamps flickered low, a telegram arrived at the station. It was from the Leeds constabulary, to whom Purbright had earlier sent word about Miss Pallithorpe's distant cousins. The telegram reported tersely, no knowledge of funeral. Cousins alive, indifferent. One, James Pallithorpe, recently in financial difficulty, not seen in Leeds for fortnight. Purbright folded the paper slowly. A missing cousin, a crow-faced stranger, and a dead woman strangled after her own burial. The strands were converging, though still loose. He felt the faint stirrings of urgency. The murderer was not finished, of that he was certain. The next morning brought confirmation. The groundsman who had first reported the disturbed grave came to the station, pale and shaking. Inspector, there was another dug spot this morning, not far from Miss Pallithorpe's. Only started, just the topsoil cleared, as if they meant to open another grave, but was interrupted. Purbright stared at him, then rose with deliberate calm. Show me. At the cemetery, the patch was as the man had said, earth disturbed, tools hastily withdrawn. A spade still leaned against a nearby tree, its handle wet with dew. The grave itself belonged to one Mr. Greaves, a tradesman buried 3 weeks past. When the surface was probed, the coffin was found undisturbed, but the implication was chilling enough. Someone was preparing to repeat the act, to tamper with another burial. Standing there in the damp morning air, Purbright understood that the affair had widened. Ada Pallithorpe's death had not been a singular crime, but part of a pattern. Whether it was theft, blackmail, or some darker obsession, the murderer was not yet finished with the cemetery of Flaxborough. And as he watched the mist curl above the gravestones, Purbright knew he would have to set a trap, for the dead, it seemed, were not being left to rest of their own accord. Inspector Purbright's decision to linger by the disturbed earth that morning was not prompted by mere curiosity, but by the instinctive pull of something unfinished. He had learned to trust such instincts, even when they seemed less tangible than the facts at hand. He remained there long after the groundsman had retreated to a safer distance, his eyes following the uneven gouges of the spade and the hurried scatter of earth about the grave. Whoever had begun this work had been interrupted, or had interrupted themselves. The difference between the two was subtle, but it mattered. "Sir," Sergeant Love said at last, breaking into Purbright's thoughts, "it might have been nothing more than mischief. Youngsters, perhaps." Purbright's gaze swept across the fog-laden churchyard, its crooked headstones rising like sentinels in the pale light. "No, love. Mischief makes noise and children leave traces of laughter. This was quiet work, deliberate. Whoever started this had intent. And intent," he glanced down at the spade, "is rarely abandoned without reason." Love bent to pick up the tool, then frowned. "It's clean, sir. Handle's dry too, save for the dew. I'd swear it hasn't been used more than once or twice. Looks newly bought." The inspector reached out, examined the steel blade, and noted its unscuffed edge. "New tools for fresh business," he murmured. "This is no casual trespass. The man means to return." Purbright left constables to guard the cemetery through the coming nights, warning them with grim clarity that the visitor they awaited was no common thief. He returned to his office with Love, the unease in him sharpening into determination. By now the threads of the case were gathering into a noose that might yet fall round the wrong neck if he were careless. The telegram about James Pallithorpe remained foremost in his mind. The cousin in financial ruin, vanished from Leeds, could not be ignored. Yet the figure of the crow-faced stranger, Mr. Ainsley, pressed just as hard upon him. Two men, one known by name and circumstance, the other by disguise and shadow, and somewhere between them a dead spinster laid twice to rest. Later that afternoon, Purbright sent Love northward with instructions to work through every coach and railway record he could find for James Pallithorpe's movements. Inquiries about Mr. Ainsley would continue closer to home, for it was here in Flaxborough that the man's trail remained warm. The inspector himself walked once more to the lodging-house where Ainsley had stayed. The landlady received him with visible relief, as though eager to share news. "Inspector, the gentleman returned last night, late, near midnight. He went up without a word. This morning I saw him leave with his case. Paid another day's lodging, but he hasn't come back since." "And which way did he go?" Purbright asked. "Down toward the quay, I think, though he might have turned off before the water." The quay was a haunt for those wishing to move unseen. Labourers, vagrants, men who found it easier to disappear among the stacks of timber and coal. Purbright spent the evening making discreet inquiries there, but if Ainsley had passed through, he had vanished like mist into mist. By nightfall, with Love still absent on his errand, Purbright allowed himself only the solace of routine paperwork before returning home. He carried with him a weight of disquiet, which pressed heavier, when at dawn a messenger arrived breathless at his door. Another grave had been disturbed. This time the attempt was clumsier, as though carried out in haste. The site lay deeper within the churchyard, among older stones worn illegible by weather. The coffin there had been broken open, splintered by brute force. Yet the body remained untouched, though its shroud had been pulled aside. It was as if the intruder had searched for something that was not there, and in frustration abandoned the effort. The groundsman was near hysterical. "It's devilry, sir! First Miss Pallithorpe, and now poor Greaves left in peace, only to be gawked at. I'll not keep watch again, not for all the wages of Flaxborough." Purbright quieted the man with more gentleness than usual. He knew well enough that superstition had its uses. Fear might keep gossip alive, but it also ensured the town remained alert. At the grave, the inspector crouched low, his sharp eyes noting the scattered traces. A matchstick lay blackened on the soil, evidence of a candle or lantern used for light. A half-print in the mud showed the worn heel of a shoe, narrow, pointed, almost foreign in cut. And near the edge of the hole, half buried in loose earth, gleamed a tiny scrap of metal, a broken clasp from a small case or box. He slipped it into his pocket, his mind already turning over the possibilities. A case like the one Mr. Ainsley was said to guard so carefully. Could it have been damaged here, in the act of digging? By noon, Sergeant Love had returned, weary but flushed with discovery. "Sir, I traced James Pallithorpe, left Leeds fortnight ago as we knew. Bought a ticket southward but never arrived at the station named. Fellow fitting his description was seen alighting halfway, at Market Fenton, where he hired a trap to Flaxborough." "Then he is here," Purbright said with quiet certainty. "Or was, sir. Nobody's seen him since. Between Ainsley and James Pallithorpe, the net was tightening." Purbright allowed himself no assumption yet, but a picture was beginning to form, a picture of collusion perhaps, or betrayal. That evening, a constable brought word of a sighting. A man in black, thin-faced, had been noticed slipping into the churchyard just before dusk. The constable had lost him among the stones, but swore he had carried a small case under his arm. Purbright ordered the ground secured, lanterns stationed, and plainclothes men set to patrol. He himself remained at the cemetery, waiting in the chill air as night deepened. It was a vigil that seemed endless, the silence broken only by the distant cry of an owl and the shifting of earth underfoot. Then, as the hour neared midnight, a figure detached itself from the shadows, tall, angular, moving with the caution of one who knows he trespasses. In his hand was indeed a small case. Purbright stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Mr. Ainsley, I believe?" The man started, his sharp face catching the glint of lantern light. For an instant his expression was that of a creature cornered. Then he bolted. The chase through the gravestones was swift and treacherous. Love, stumbling but determined, cut across to intercept. The fugitive darted between tombs, his black coat flaring like wings. Finally, he stumbled upon uneven ground, and the case flew from his grasp. Purbright was upon him in a moment, restraining his wiry arms with unexpected strength. The case lay open on the ground, its contents spilling faintly in the lantern light. Within were small envelopes, each sealed, each bearing names and dates. At first glance, they resembled nothing more than legal documents, but Purbright's practiced eye saw the pattern. Each one matched a burial, some recent, some long past. He lifted one envelope, its label stark, Ada Pallithorpe, payment received. The man writhed in his grasp, his crow-like features twisted with fear and rage. "You don't understand," he hissed. "They paid me! They all paid me!" Purbright tightened his hold, his voice even. "Then you had best begin explaining, for the dead are not in the habit of settling accounts." Inspector Purbright's grip on the man's arm did not loosen until the constables had arrived and relieved him of the struggle. The crow-faced figure, panting and half-spent from his dash through the gravestones, glared with a bitterness that seemed to rise from more than mere defeat. There was something feverish in his eyes, as though desperation had burned reason away. The small case, its papers strewn across the damp grass, drew the inspector's attention more insistently than its owner's protests. Each envelope he retrieved bore a neat, businesslike hand, names of the deceased, dates of interment, and besides some, notations such as settled in full or balance remaining. The starkest, of course, was the one bearing Ada Palathorpe's name. Purbright felt the tug of a grim recognition. This was not random desecration, but a ledger of bargains made at the border between life and death. "Bring him along," he ordered quietly, and the constables hauled the man to his feet. He went without further resistance, only muttering under his breath words too low and too rapid to catch. At the station, under the jaundiced glare of the lamps, the prisoner gave his name willingly enough. Edmund Ainsley, lately, of York, formerly a clerk of no particular note. His trade, however, was more interesting. Under questioning, with Love standing by as silent witness, Ainsley confessed that for years he had trafficked in secrets of the dead. Families, burdened by shameful pasts or fearful of posthumous scandal, had sought him out to ensure that no paper, letter, or relic remained to incriminate their kin once they lay in the ground. For a fee he would tidy matters at the graveside, removing, substituting, or burying anew whatever threatened to embarrass the living. "I am no ghoul," he declared with trembling fervour. "I never harmed a soul. I merely spared them indignity. But those who promised to pay, they forget. They think once the coffin lid is closed, their obligation dies too. Yet I have kept account, Inspector. I have kept account." His voice cracked, rising almost to a shout before falling again into muttering. Purbright let the silence stretch until Ainsley's breathing slowed. Then, in a tone carefully even, he asked, "And what of Miss Palathorpe? What debt was owed her?" Ainsley's gaze flickered, evasive now. "Her brother's papers. A matter of inheritance, some years back. She begged that I take them from the coffin lest her kin dispute her claim. I did as she asked, but there was more owed to me than she cared to admit. When she died, well, I thought it meet that her account be settled." Love shifted uncomfortably. "You mean to say you dug her up to claim a debt?" The man only smiled thinly, a ghastly twist of lips. But Purbright, watching closely, knew this was not the full measure of his purpose. The broken clasp found at the second grave, the frantic scattering of earth, the half-buried shroud, it spoke not of orderly removal, but of desperate searching. What had Ainsley lost, or whom had he sought? The interrogation ended with Ainsley confined to a cell, his case and its contents sealed for examination. Love, though visibly shaken, admitted as they walked from the charge room, "It's a queer trade, sir, but it rings with a sort of truth. There are folk enough in Flaxborough who'd pay handsomely to keep their skeletons where they belong." "Yes," Purbright replied, his brow furrowed. "Yet it is not trade alone that drove him. He was hunting something, or someone, and I intend to know what." The following morning brought no peace. A telegram from Leeds confirmed that James Palathorpe had indeed disappeared from his lodgings without notice, leaving debts behind. Worse, a pawnbroker in Market Fenton had come forward with a tale of a man resembling him attempting to redeem a set of family silver, only to be turned away for lack of proof. The description matched James almost perfectly, save that the pawnbroker thought him older, more worn, as though life had pressed him thin. Purbright considered this news with growing unease. Ainsley might have kept his ledgers, but debts of blood were another matter. The Palathorpe family, if one could call it that, was riven with grievances. Could James have returned to settle his own account with his cousin's grave? Or was he in league with Ainsley, using the clerk's macabre profession as cover for darker purpose? That evening, the inspector returned alone to the churchyard, lantern in hand, his footsteps muffled on the damp earth. He walked among the stones as though in meditation, pausing at each grave that Ainsley's envelopes had marked. Here a tradesman, here a solicitor's wife, here a child whose death had been sudden and unexplained. The pattern was not merely mercenary, it was selective. Each grave represented a knot of scandal or dispute, each one a wound in the quiet fabric of the town. It was as he lingered at the far corner, near a crumbling wall, that he heard it, the faint scrape of stone against stone. He raised the lantern, its light spilling across the lichen, and there, crouched low as a thief, was a man in shabby coat and battered hat. The face that looked up was gaunt, eyes hollowed by hunger and flight, but the resemblance was unmistakable. James Palathorpe. He bolted, just as Ainsley had done, but this time Purbright was ready. He shouted for the constable stationed at the gate, and together they pursued the fugitive through the rows of graves until he stumbled and fell among the nettles. Dragged to his feet, James fought only weakly, his exhaustion plain. Back at the station, under lamplight, his tale poured forth in fits and starts. He had fled Leeds under debts he could not pay, seeking refuge in Flaxborough, with the half-formed hope of claiming what little inheritance Ada had left. Ainsley, he confessed, had written to him weeks before her death, hinting that certain papers of consequence still lay within her grave, papers that might prove valuable to him. It was this promise that had drawn him back, though he swore he had not laid a hand to her coffin himself. "Then why were you found tonight, prying at another stone?" Purbright asked quietly. James faltered, eyes darting. I thought there might be more. Ainsley said he kept records, that others too had debts to hide. I wanted only to see if something there might serve me. You must believe me, Inspector. I never meant harm. The inspector regarded him without expression. Between Ainsley and James the truth lay tangled, each man's confession shading the other's guilt. Yet the direction of the case had sharpened. Ada Palathorpe's grave had been disturbed not out of idle malice, but because she had conspired with Ainsley in life and, in death, left behind a trail worth pursuing. Purbright dismissed James to the cells with a weary nod, and as the door clanged shut, he felt the weight of the inquiry settle heavier upon him. 2 men now sat within his custody, each bound by secrets, each gnawing at the same grave for different ends. Somewhere in their overlapping tales lay the true heart of the matter. As he prepared his report for the magistrate, Purbright allowed himself one final reflection. In Flaxborough, the dead did not lie quietly. Their pasts reached up like roots to trip the living, and it would fall to him, with patience and persistence, to untangle those roots before they strangled the town entire. Yet as he set down his pen, a constable rapped urgently at the door. "Sir, another grave's been touched, fresh, just this night, and neither of your prisoners could have done it." Purbright rose at once, his fatigue swept aside. The noose was tightening, yes, but not around the neck, he had thought. The game was not yet done, and the living still had business with the dead. Inspector Purbright did not pause for a second inquiry. His hat was on, and his coat gathered before the constable had even finished his breathless message. The boy had run all the way from the churchyard, cheeks raw from the cold night air, and still managed to stammer that the soil about one of the more recently dug graves bore signs of meddling. Purbright, with love called from his supper, and a lantern thrust into the younger man's hand made straight for the site. The lane leading up to the churchyard was dark but for the scatter of starlight and the wavering glow of their lamps. The inspector walked steadily, but with the quickness of a man unwilling to surrender time to uncertainty. Love, by contrast, stumbled at intervals on the uneven ground, though he kept his tongue wisely still, sensing that his superior was already ruminating on a knot too intricate to bear interruption. When they arrived, the constable on guard pointed with his truncheon. "There, sir. I saw it not an hour ago when I walked the round. Was smooth then. Now look." The earth above the grave was unsettled, clods scattered untidily across the grass, as though a hurried hand had clawed downward before being interrupted. The headstone belonged to Mrs. Hetty Broom, a respectable draper's widow who had died only 6 weeks prior of an apoplexy in her parlour. Purbright knelt, brushing the surface lightly with his gloved fingers. The disturbance was shallow, no more than half a foot, and abandoned before it reached the coffin. "Too little done for exhumation," he murmured, "too much for mischief." Love peered over his shoulder. "Same hand as before, you think, sir?" The inspector straightened, his gaze travelling across the rows of stones where the mist lay like a low tide. "Number both Ainsley and Pallithorpe are behind bars. Someone else has been drawn to this ground. That is the matter now before us." He ordered the grave cordoned until daylight, when proper examination could be made, and led Love back along the path. The younger man, perplexed, ventured at last, "But what reason would anyone have for Mrs. Broom's grave? She had no family scandal that I ever heard." "Nor I," Purbright agreed, "which makes her intrusion all the more significant. If scandal is lacking, then perhaps the value lies elsewhere." The following morning saw the grave opened under the supervision of the coroner and vicar. The coffin, when uncovered, bore no sign of tampering, its fittings intact, its contents presumably undisturbed. But at one corner, tucked between wood and earth, the diggers found a small parcel wrapped in oiled cloth. When unwrapped, it revealed a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Purbright received them with a careful hand, and once, back at the station, examined their contents with Love present. The letters were written in a masculine scrawl, intimate in tone, and signed with a name that made the inspector purse his lips: Councillor Ernest Prowse. Love's eyebrows shot up. "Prowse? But his wife still sits on every committee in town. She'll perish of shame if this gets out." "Which is likely why they were hidden," Purbright said dryly. "Not destroyed, but concealed, and concealed with the aid of Ainsley, no doubt. Yet if he is in our cells, who sought to recover them?" The question hung in the stale air of the office. Prowse himself was no longer young, and his dealings in the council chamber had always been dogged by whispers of impropriety, though none proved. These letters, if public, would suffice to unseat him, perhaps worse. That evening, Purbright paid a call on the Prowse household. The councillor received him in his dressing gown, red-faced and uneasy. Purbright, polite but implacable, laid the letters upon the table between them. Prowse's reaction was immediate. His hands trembled, his voice shrank to a rasp. "Good God, Inspector, where did you obtain these?" "They were found in a grave, Councillor." "Not yours?" "Not yet." "Tell me why they were placed there, and who might have reason to fetch them out again." The man sagged in his chair, his eyes shifting to the door, where upstairs his wife's footsteps could be faintly heard. "I was a fool. Years ago. Hetty Broom was a comfort to me in a darker time. Ainsley, he was known even then. He promised to keep the letters safe, should my wife ever discover them. I paid him well for the service. That he chose a grave as his strong-box I never asked. I preferred not to know." "Did you tell anyone else of this arrangement?" Number no one. I had not thought of it in years. His expression hardened suddenly. If those letters had been used against me, Inspector, it would have ruined all I've built. But who could have known where they lay? Not Ainsley alone, surely? Purbright regarded him steadily. No, Counsellor, which suggests Ainsley kept less discretion than you paid for. Back at the station he found his thoughts circling, not Prowse, but the nature of Ainsley's records. The clerk had kept meticulous account of every transaction, but what if those ledgers contained not merely debts, but the very map of his hidden caches? Each grave that bore his touch might hold not bones disturbed, but secrets buried. James Pallethorpe, pale and restless in his cell, called out as Purbright passed. "Inspector, you see now, don't you? He promised me Ada's papers, swore they'd still be there. He kept lists. If you find them, you'll find everything." Purbright paused. And who else might have wished to see those lists? James licked dry lips. "Any of them, sir. Any who paid him. They'd kill to keep their names from daylight." The inspector left him and returned to his office, the unease in his chest deepening. The pattern had broadened. First Ada Pallethorpe's grave, then Mrs. Broom's, and through both ran Ainsley's furtive trade in concealment. But now, with the clerk in custody, someone else had taken up the spade, hunting not the dead, but the secrets buried among them. That night, Purbright took the precaution of assigning constables to patrol the churchyard in shifts, though he doubted the intruder would strike again so soon. Yet near dawn, word came that another grave had been disturbed, not opened, but marked. A small chisel had been used to scratch a crude symbol into the stone, a circle intersected by a line. Purbright went at once. The grave belonged to an elderly solicitor, one Thomas Kendall, deceased a decade. The mark was fresh, gouged deep and deliberate. Love bent over it with a puzzled frown. "Some kind of sign?" "Yes," Purbright said softly, his mind working. "A message, perhaps, or a claim. Whatever it is, it was left for us to find." As the morning sun thinned the mist, the inspector stood amidst the stones, his face grave. Someone was not merely digging in Flaxborough's soil. They were speaking in it, using the graves as ledger and letterbox both. And until he understood the language, the dead would not lie quiet, nor the living safe. The candlelight in the vestry had long since guttered out, but Inspector Purbright lingered there, listening to the hollow echoes of his own footsteps on the flagstones. The evening had tightened about Flaxborough like a net. A few hours earlier, the case had seemed a skein of loose threads, a coffin without a body, a grave dug in secret, and a sequence of whispering townsfolk eager to direct suspicion elsewhere. Now, at last, the tangled knots began to yield under his persistence. He could almost feel the pattern forming beneath his hands, though not yet fully revealed. The night was not finished with him. Sergeant Love entered quietly, cap in hand, his face pale from the chill outside. "Sir," he began cautiously, "Miss Albright has agreed to speak. She's waiting at the station. Seems she's grown weary of Mr. Cundall's insistence she hold her tongue. I believe she knows more than she first admitted." Purbright's gaze drifted to the black window-pane. "Then we should not keep her waiting. Secrets rot more swiftly than corpses, and often with worse consequences." At the station, Miss Albright sat stiff-backed, fingers clutched round the handle of her handbag as though it were a lifeline. She looked neither at Purbright nor at Love when they entered, but at the wall beyond them. When Purbright spoke her name, she flinched, as if dragged from some reverie she would rather not have broken. "I do not wish to cause unpleasantness, Inspector," she said faintly, "but I cannot bear the guilt of silence any longer. That coffin—" Her voice broke. She steadied it. It was never meant to contain a corpse. Love's mouth dropped open, but Purbright merely inclined his head, waiting. It was arranged, Miss Albright continued, by Councillor Cundall himself. A show, nothing more. The coffin was weighted with sandbags. The burial was to convince those who suspected. He said it was the only way to protect her. Her? Purbright repeated softly. Miss Albright twisted her gloves. His daughter, Lydia. A chill seemed to seep into the room, though no draught stirred the air. Purbright leaned forward. Lydia Cundall has been absent from Flaxborough these past months. There were whispers she had left for the continent. Are you telling me she has not? Miss Albright's eyes glistened. She never left at all. She died, by accident, in that very house. One night of storm, she fell on the stairs. Cundall could not endure the scandal of it. He believed the world would whisper of drink, of impropriety, of disgrace. So he contrived a burial to satisfy the parish, but the coffin he ordered bore no daughter within it. The words hung in the air, terrible in their simplicity. Love whispered, "Then the grave is false." Purbright closed his eyes a moment, seeing again the empty coffin, the crumbling soil of the churchyard. "No, Sergeant," he said quietly. "The grave is true enough. What it lacks is honesty." Later that night, with a search warrant in hand, Purbright led a small, solemn party back to Councillor Cundall's house. The wind rose as if to protest, rattling the shutters. The councillor himself awaited them in his study, pale and defiant, the decanter on the table more than half drained. "I suppose," he said hoarsely, "that Miss Albright has betrayed me. I should have known her conscience was never so easily lulled." "You deceived the parish, the church, the law itself," Purbright replied evenly. "Where is your daughter's body, councillor?" For a moment, silence pressed like a hand upon the room. Then, with something between a groan and a sigh, Cundall pointed toward the narrow stair that wound to the cellars below. "She rests there, where she fell. I would not move her farther." The descent was grim. The cellar smelled of damp stone and old coal. At its farthest corner lay a shrouded form carefully covered, a faint perfume lingering as though in memory of youth. Purbright stood, hat in hand, as the sergeant gently drew back the cloth to reveal the pale features of a young woman, peaceful now, but touched by the irrevocable silence of death. The councillor's voice trembled behind them. "I told myself I had spared her, that a scandal would stain her memory while secrecy would keep her untainted. But each day the lie grew heavier. I thought to bury the world's suspicion in that coffin, but it only multiplied." Purbright turned slowly, his eyes neither hard nor pitying, but weighted with something more difficult. "Truth denied is never silenced, councillor. It waits, and when it speaks it is louder than any whisper. There was no struggle when Cundall was led away. Only a man bent with weariness who seemed almost relieved that the burden had been lifted at last. In the weeks that followed, Flaxborough buzzed with the tale, yet in hushed tones, as if reluctant to acknowledge how close the town had come to embracing a falsehood. Miss Albright resigned her position and withdrew from society. The churchyard grave, emptied of deception, was filled anew, this time with Lydia herself, gently and honestly laid to rest. On a grey morning, Purbright attended that second burial, standing a little apart from the mourners. He watched as the earth fell softly on the coffin that at last contained what it claimed. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint tolling of the church bell, mournful yet resolute. Love approached, hat clutched nervously. "Strange business, sir, all that deceit for the sake of dignity. You'd think truth was cheaper to keep." Purbright gave a faint smile, his gaze lingering on the grave. Dignity, Sergeant, is rarely inexpensive, and false dignity costs most of all. They walked back together through the churchyard, the damp grass muffling their steps. Flaxborough would continue as it always had, its gossip, its secrets, its quiet dramas. But for the inspector, another page had been turned, another shadow dispersed, though never quite erased. As evening fell, Purbright returned to his office. The paperwork already awaited him, neatly stacked, demanding his signature. He lit his pipe, settling into the familiar comfort of tobacco, and thought. The case of the coffin without a body was concluded, but its echo would remain in the town's collective memory, a reminder that death is rarely the most frightening thing in Flaxborough. More often, it is the lies of the living. And so, with the faintest sigh, Inspector Purbright dipped his pen, ready to record the truth that had at last emerged from the darkness. The matter was closed.